Oh, thank you. Thanks, Wayne. And what a privilege! What a privilege it is to be able to join in this. I know you've invited me a number of times, sent invitations to join TGIF, and there's always been something happening. And actually, I thought this was a way of you getting me hooked on, and to get me to come and talk about something that would make me get hooked. And I have to say that I've missed this kind of connection. The topic, the spirituality of shepherding the flock that you cannot touch, hope in the time of a pandemic, sounds like a PhD dissertation. And after I had sent it, I thought, gee, what have I done? What have I put myself into? People are going to be expecting some earth-shattering ideas and all of that, and yet this is something really simple for me. It is nothing very complicated. But maybe just to start as a way of offering a background, and it is a background that we are all familiar with, that we all find ourselves within the era of COVID-19, and with its advent, it brought so much pressure on a global level, affecting almost all countries, societies, and as we are well aware, our health systems throughout the world. And perhaps on a local level, I mean, even broadly, it disrupted varying spheres of the social, the political and economic lives, intruded into our spiritual domain, and it's basically spirituality in general being the foundation of human existence, how we find meaning and purpose and experience our connectedness to the moment, to the place where we find ourselves, and to the people that we interact with, but mainly with God. And it's really that intersection that has, I suppose, interested me to try and stand back and look at it from that perspective. And we found ourselves having to learn new routines and learning new routine in a time of loneliness and detachment and isolation. I think one of the saddest things for me as a minister in a church is to accompany people who are going through bereavement, that they get a shock of their lives when that which they have known all along, when death occurs at home, they knew that they would go to the church and they would have all the support, particularly, let's say, in the African perspective, people would be visiting the homes, their home in the week to comfort and support them. And all of that was just simply pulled under their feet. And it became such a difficult terrain to be in. And of course, the other experience is the sad reality of people dying alone, where family members could not visit them in hospital. And then worldwide, when one reads and listens, you got this sense of fear, anxiety, depression, stress, and all those levels peaked. So I thought, COVID-19 has deprived us of one of the most fundamental human needs, or maybe at least two of those, one being touch and the other being communal support. Touch for us in our church liturgy, as part of the worship, there comes a time when we have to share the peace in church. And I remember even before we went into lockdown, when we were still preparing for the eventuality, I had to say to the congregation, we're no longer going to pass the peace, shaking hands and so on. And it was a little time of connection. And in terms of our liturgical church worship, that was lost immediately, and it was felt deeply by people. They felt immediately disconnected, and of course, when we went into lockdown, that just made matters worse. So all this was quickly made real in our country when we then eventually went into lockdown. And so this is my reflection based on my interaction basically with three authors, interestingly from different perspectives and really chance encounters. The first one is Jared Wilson of the Gospel Coalition. Right early on in March, I think it was the end of March, when we were all scrambling to say, well, what are we going to do in terms of worship? We can no longer meet in church and all of that. I was doing some bit of reading, and I came across an article of his where he was encouraging ministers and pastors to not become despondent during this time of isolation, but that they should continue to minister to their flock in the best way possible. And he outlined four things that really, really resonated with me. They just grabbed my attention. So simple ones. And the first one, he says, keep preaching. Keep preaching. Do not sit back and say, well, I do not know what to say anymore, which unfortunately some of our ministers did. They sat back at home and said, well, they were paralyzed. And he said, keep preaching. There's the second thing was, resource your online community with material for their own worship at home and their own personal devotion. And then thirdly, he said, communicate with your community. Find a way of getting in touch with them throughout this time. And then lastly, he said, keep praying. Those were things that you could possibly take for granted. And yet for me, when I came across that, that was a turning point in how I was going to interact with my church community. They impacted my ministry so much. And I look back and realize that this is actually what has kept our community spiritually connected and with me as well, connected with them. Well, I'll say a little bit more. And then, secondly, by the way, these are not necessarily by any order. It's just how I've arranged my reflection. Secondly, recently at our Clergy Development Day, each month we have a clergy day where all the ministers in the diocese, we get to have a reflection of some sort, whether it's on theology, on spirituality, or whatever. And our bishop invited Trevor Hudson, where he just came to, he said, come and just encourage our clergy at this time. And some really useful nuggets on how to keep our spiritual lives as pastoral workers, as ministers, recharged so that we don't run on empty. That was basically his main topic, running empty. He shared some salient points modeled on the character of Jesus and what sustained his own ministry. And I really found myself resonating with what he said, and basically mentioned 3 points that he elaborated a little further, but they really stayed with me because they were like anchors that I just hung on, and I couldn't let go. And he said, when we look at the ministry of Jesus or the character of Jesus, he said he sustained himself by carving into his life moments where he stopped, he disengaged from the immense needs around him, and he went and sought stillness and solitude or reflection. He often went away, as we often hear. We hear in the gospel passages how he'd often go away on his own for prayer. And he said, we need that more than ever. because we although we are disconnected from our community, we can only connect with them online, but we are actually busier than we ever found ourselves. And that was a reality for me. And he said the second point was that Jesus cultivated circles of friendship. He never ministered alone, but he was nurtured by meaningful relationships. And we know instances where he went to visit his friends, Martha and Mary. We know the various connections that he has had, even at Lazarus' death. There was that deep connection of friendship. And he said these were the means of sustaining grace. And then thirdly, he said, this actually surprised me because I never thought of it in that way. And he said, Jesus often cultivated a life of real joy. He cultivated a life of real joy. And that happened within the cries and the pains and the weariness and exhaustion of his ministry, as we can imagine. And he said, in the midst of the hustle and bustle of life, he brought and sought joy and participated in it in a real sense. The wedding at Cana, where he turned water into wine, enjoying the company of children, dinners with friends. How often do we hear of him being invited to a meal, to a dinner with friends? So he said, if you look closely, you realize he cultivated real joy in his life. So these really stayed with me as they connected with the previous author who talked about those 4 points that I mentioned. And I found myself immersing myself into this and asking of myself, how am I reacting to this? How am I interacting with this? So what challenged me, even after that talk, was I started thinking to myself, and we asked questions for reflection, but I started asking myself, how do I punctuate my hectic life with moments of personal rest, moments of stillness and reflection? What practices or disciplines rejuvenate and nurture my ministry? And I found that the very resources that I had been sending out to my online community also sustained me. Simple things such as morning prayer. Wayne and I have had a conversation around this, where I have this app where I could either go through the liturgy of morning prayer, or I could just sit quietly and put it on audio and just listen to everything. So I started thinking of all those things, and I thought, gosh, I've taken these for granted. And actually, this is what has been sustaining my own ministry. I began to appreciate the circle of friends who have sustained me during this time of isolation. We live in a big property. So Alison being a recently ordained minister, Alison being my wife, a recently ordained minister, she's a deacon, and the assistant priest who lives on the church property. The first few weeks of lockdown were really hard. But we found ourselves saying, after about 14 days, we said, listen, we are living in a bubble here. Why don't we meet every morning for morning prayer together? We'll sit in the chapel because the church is just close by. It's quiet. We'll sit in the chapel, keep a distance from one another. We'll sanitize. We'll do all the things that we're asked to do and just pray together. Again, something that I thought, yeah, I suppose it would be nice. But actually, I found as we continued with that, we became a family. And those were some of the practices that sustained my own ministry. And I realized, gosh, there is a connection with what Trevor was saying, sustaining meaningful relationships. And then I thought to myself, how do I recover the joy of Christ in my life? Because ministry can be so heavy, particularly now when you're isolated. You do more, you meet more, I'm sure we've all gone through a Zoom fatigue. I found that reliance on family, where we spent time simply enjoying one another, was one of those moments that I just loved. I just enjoyed it. It cultivated in a real way a life of joy. And therefore, I found myself being nurtured to, or spurred on to do more and to continue. Because the upside of the isolation due to COVID-19 is, of course, our reliance on online church or online worship, where the Christian community turned the social media platforms into what I call sacred spaces, and turned them into opportunities of encounter with God and encounter with fellow Christians, and even across the globe. And just overnight, a decision to go into lockdown because of this pandemic changed our lives in how we related to other people, fellow Christians, those who are seeking something in their lives. They found themselves drawn to the things that we're doing online. And suddenly, we found that we were not confined by time and space, and we could join in one another's worship experiences. And in a way, I felt that we came face to face with an incarnational God through technology, thus experiencing in a real sense what Jeffrey van der Velde's termed church, what he termed church without borders. I felt that we really are going through an experience of church without borders, because we know we're no longer alone. And we know that whatever we put online is out there, anybody can interact with it. So because we were denied access to our worship buildings, for me, one of the reflections I made and in communicating with my parish was that the home had become the primary place where the body of Christ truly existed, even in a mystical sense. The family, that they received resources at home, and they found themselves enacting what would have been happening at church in a building. They were doing that at home. And so I thought, well, the challenge facing us now is, what models of ministry and of church should we anticipate in terms of participation, in terms of presence? What is our idea of salvation in this time and looking ahead beyond COVID? What is, the other real question was, what in our church denominational practice, well, what is the meaning of ordination? Because I'm no longer meeting with the community and celebrating Holy Communion with them. They are at home, and we are forced into this environment. And I thought, well, these are the few lessons that I learned, or I was beginning to learn. First, even in talking to other people, accept the fact that your church is not the church, because as we see, as we interact with other people, we find a myriad of experiences that some shock you, others go, make you go, wow, I've never thought of that. Wow, I've never seen that. So it made me realize that the bubble, whether it was our denominational bubble or our congregational bubble that we lived in, was beginning to expand and to be challenged, that what you thought was the church is not. The body of Christ here on earth is Christ himself, but at the same time, we as diverse people are the real body of Christ, and he offers hope. And therefore I thought this could possibly help other people to come to terms with worshipping through TV screens and laptop screens, as we're doing right now, and that we don't conflate the two. that we start comparing ourselves with other people. Oh, how I wish I could be like that. Because what you are doing is an experience of worship. It's an experience of connection. It doesn't matter whether you're watching a service down the street or in Washington or in Salisbury Cathedral or wherever. You have to accept your church for what it is or what she is, and stop thinking that this is the church. And secondly, to accept that if you're a pastor, if you're a minister, you're a shepherd, not the shepherd, because Christ himself is the shepherd. We're simply participating in the shepherding work of Jesus. And those were sobering things to come to terms with, because suddenly I thought, this does not only depend on me alone. I'm only a participant in this. When I look for resources, when I try and connect with my community, it is not all on me. I'm only participating in the shepherding work of the great shepherd himself, not me. So a third author that fascinated me, given the title of shepherd, it also really inspired me in this whole reflection and in this looking back at the past 5 months or so, is that during this time, David Roseberry wrote a devotional book titled When the Lord is My Shepherd. And he started writing in January, and he said he had so many ideas, and as he continued, then COVID happened, and it stopped him in his tracks. And he started wondering, what do I say? He said he struggled with what to say in the face of sickness and death, the wave of sickness and death, looking around at a stagnant economy, staggering job losses. And he found himself grieving for all the families who were so terribly hurt by the coronavirus. And that too resonated with me, because our congregation here is a fairly big congregation, but there is such a greater part of that congregation which is elderly. And throughout this period of lockdown, we had a lot of deaths in the parish, in the congregation, and I found myself having to minister to them in such a difficult situation. And eventually I thought, people are not getting the idea that we can't be visiting one another at home and all of that. So I then was galvanized to say, I need to do something that they can perhaps do some kind of a worship ceremony at home. So I put together a liturgy for them to, and I sent it to them to say, here is something that you can do when you've experienced bereavement. And it was really out of that sense of grief, sense of grieving with them, where they had to go through bereavement on their own. David Roseberry said he started to read Psalm 23. And he said, as the pandemic wore on, he found himself returning to it every day, and he found it comforting. He got a sense of clarity for his own life, and he got some strength. And the more he repeated praying this psalm, he said, the more it seemed to him that these well-meaning and well-known verses were more than just beautiful lines from an ancient time. They began to seem more like promises to him. He found that the imagery in it, the phrases, the metaphor, and the lines as you read each line pointed to something that was promised to us when by our Lord Jesus Christ as the great shepherd himself, in speaking into our lives. And he said, reading the psalm daily began to fill him with more strength and confidence for a personal daily walk with Christ. And he said, that is when he could find words to begin to write this book. And so he invites the reader, in his book he says, invites the reader to reimagine the contextual world of King David. And that's another thing that really touched me, acted as an anchor that I could hang on. He said, the aim of this book, and I quote, the aim of this book is to provide a new look at a very old poem written by the ancient king of Israel, David. He said, familiarity may have caused you to overlook its daring promises and clear convictions. Given the ancient age of the poem, you might assume that its language, metaphors, and simplicity could not apply in a complex world such as ours, but it does. Because he said, reading it, he began to realize that King David was, if King David were alive today and he visited our context, he could not relate to most of our real life experiences. The technological advances that are there, the sophistication, level of sophistication, he said he probably would not be able to relate on this, but he said David would understand our fears of disease and death. David would understand what it means to be persecuted. He would understand what it means to lose a loved one. He would relate to our lives when we experience threats, when we experience danger and isolation. He said he would understand the challenges of being quarantined, as we've been. He was actually sheltered in his own city. So he said he would also understand the tensions between adult children and their parents. He would certainly understand the temptations that plague us all during this time. And he said he would be able to relate to our need to have a sense of purpose in our life. So he says the Psalm 23 has a remarkable way of breaking into the pain, the fear, and the anxiety that many people feel, especially during this time. But there was one thing that he added on the psalm. He added the single word when, and he put it in parentheses at the beginning of the title. So the title is "The Lord is my shepherd." And so he then added the word when, and he said, when the Lord is my shepherd. And when I read that, and it was almost like listening to him talking, I thought, this changes my understanding of the psalm and my understanding of the relationship that David had with God. He says that word acted like a handle. And in my mind, I thought it's like a crutch that you could actually use that if you're limping, whether spiritually, psychologically, or whatever. And it allows us to carry the truth of David's psalm into our hearts, into our minds, into our lives now. And so this had a profound effect on me. I began to see the world shifting and changing right in front of my eyes when I started reading that psalm. When the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. And I'm not going to read the whole psalm, but you get the idea. When we read it like that, the Lord's my shepherd, and we sing it, especially at funerals and all of that. But when you begin to read it in that sense, it speaks to you from where you are. When the Lord is my shepherd, everything else follow. So a combination of these three encounters with the three authors impacted my life in a profound way that they helped me to filter the many voices, particularly as I wondered what it meant to minister to a flock, a congregation that I couldn't see or even touch. Each week, we would record services in an empty church, and I would wonder whether all that mattered. Our liturgy is one that is interactive, and therefore when you say things like, "The Lord be with you," usually the congregation would respond, "and also with you." And that became very difficult for the three of us, where there was just two people who would say, "and also with you," sitting very far away from one another. But as I reflected on Jared Wilson's 4 suggestions, keep preaching, I learned the tools of the media trade very quickly. It's something that was thrust, I was thrust into, or we were, to enhance our preaching. I found myself delving into areas that I'd never thought I would do, getting teleprompters to help me to look natural when speaking to the congregation, because I knew that they would be watching me on their screens. And when he said, resource your online church community, that's when I started producing, right at the beginning, producing devotional helps and other resources to aid our community, our parishioners in their private worship at home. And he says, communicate. And even before I read this, I found myself wondering, how am I going to help our congregation to remain connected with the church? And I suddenly started this practice of writing a letter to the congregation every week. And then as we reflected together, we started doing other things, like doing a 1-minute motivational video recording that we would post in the midweek. So we divided the week into parts. So on the Sunday, they would get a whole service with a sermon. And then we thought, the week is too long. Let us punctuate it with something short, a motivational video. And we posted it. And as time went on, we added a few more. But one of the things that we also added on a daily basis was to give them a simple morning prayer that we posted online on Facebook, on our website, to say, here is something that you can use at home. And then keep praying. I felt encouraged to explore things that I never dreamed of. I started recording songs that could be incorporated in our own online worship service. I wasn't bold enough to even suggest that I could play one of those for you to hear. Still timid, but I learned, because I love singing, I learned to record songs and record the different voices, and basically self-taught. And I realized it is this season of COVID-19 that has pushed me in that realm. So I look back over the past 5 months or so and realized that this is what kept our community spiritually connected. This is what has helped me to remain spiritually connected and motivated. I found that I was more hopeful, and that hope inspired the flock that I shepherded, even if it is through a computer screen or when I gathered with them in their bereavement and loss, in their vulnerability and in their alienation. Thank you.